you with songs of deliverance. David's been talking this whole time, but in verse 8, God is talking. I will instruct and teach you. In this way that you are to go, I will give you counsel. My eyes will be watching you. And then David speaks again. Don't be like a horse or a mule that has no understanding, that has to be curbed with a bit and a bridle, or else it won't come near you. Many are the torments of the wicked, but grace surrounds those who trust. There it is again, who trust Adonai. Be glad in Adonai. Rejoice, you righteous. Shout for joy, all you of upright heart. Rejoice, you righteous. Why are you righteous? Because you're trusting. Why was David righteous? Because he trusted. David is called a man after God's own heart. Why? Right there. It's right there. He's saying, when I kept silent, my bones wasted away. But when I acknowledged my sin to you, you forgave me. And then he starts singing. David trusted even when he'd sinned. David knew this relationship. And that's why David's so precious. He's this Old Testament figure. Again, this idea, oh, the New Testament is grace and the Old Testament is not. No. Look at David. David was all grace. He believed God would forgive him. And I think it's safe to say that it was credited to God for righteousness. To David for righteousness. This is David, the man of war. This is David, the adulterer, the murderer. And God forgave him. That's why, because David knew when he'd done wrong, he went like that to God when it had been pointed out to him. Back to Romans 4, verse 9. How is this blessing, the blessing that David has just told us about in Psalm 32? Now, is this blessing for the circumcised only, or is it for the uncircumcised? For we say that Abraham's trust was credited to his account as righteousness. But what state was he in when it was so credited? In circumcision or in uncircumcision? Not in circumcision, but in uncircumcision. In fact, he received circumcision as a sign, as a seal of the righteousness he had been credited with on the ground of the trust he had while he was still uncircumcised. This happened so that he could be the father of every uncircumcised person who trusts and thus has righteousness credited to him. At the same time, be the father of every circumcised person who not only has had a Brit Milah, or a circumcision, but also follows in the footsteps of the trust which Abraham, our father, had when he was still uncircumcised. Paul is awesome here. He's writing to the church at Rome. Remember that. And this is an early congregation. They're probably mixed with Romans from all over Rome, from all over the Roman Empire, and Jewish believers. And so here, Paul is making the point. Okay, Abraham was credited with righteousness. Was he circumcised yet? No. If you read this promise of the covenant, well, we read earlier, when he promised him the son, that was Genesis 15. Abraham isn't circumcised until Genesis 17. So he's not officially a Jew until Genesis 17. And yet God had already accounted his belief as righteousness. Abraham was just a Gentile Iraqi when God called him. If you look at the city of Ur, it is where Iraq is today. And God tells him, I want you to go 650 miles west. Yes, west. And just to give you context, this little island of yours is 600 miles tall. So it's further than going from Penzance to Wink. Yes. I did Wick because I didn't see. But anyway, roughly 600 miles. 660 Ur to Hebron, which is where Abraham ended up. Okay. So Abraham was a Gentile when he was called. He was just a regular guy. He wasn't a Jew. There were no Jews. He was a Hebrew. He was a Hebrew because there's a guy named Eber in the genealogy. That's where Hebrew comes from. But he wasn't a Jew as we think of. All right. Romans 4, verse 13. For the promise to Abraham and his seed that he would inherit the world did not come through legalism, but through the righteousness that trust produces. For if the heirs are produced by legalism, then trust is pointless, and the promise is worthless. For what law brings is punishment. But where there is no law, there is also no violation. The promise to Abraham was of a son who would ultimately rule the world, the Messiah. And Paul makes that case in Galatians 3, that the seed of Abraham is Messiah. But we won't go there right now. So why is the promise through legalism, why is the promise not through legalism but by trust? Sarah and Abraham were incapable of having children. Sarah hadn't had any children up to this point. They were beyond childbearing years. And there was nothing they could do. There was nothing they could do. But God says, you're going to have a child. And that's why there is no legalism there. In this day and age, you can have surgery, you can do in vitro fertilization, surrogates, although Sarah did give Abraham Hagar, but I don't think that's what we meant by surrogate. But there was really nothing they could do. And yet God says, you're going to have a son. And so it's by the promise. There's only one thing they could do, and that's act out on that faith. And that meant that they did have to have sex. They were going to have to take that step of faith, right? But other than that, there was nothing they could physically do. They had to act out on their faith. But other than that, there was no works for them to do. And that's why it's the son of promise, the son of trusting. And how does this apply to us today? Has God made you a promise? Legalistic works will not manifest the promise any faster. Only trusting, usually waiting, and acting in faith. If there's something God has asked you to do, to move in faith towards that, you have to be obedient. It's not to earn a wage, but to show you believe. When God stopped Abraham from sacrificing Isaac, Abraham already had the knife over his head. He had to act that out. And God stopped him. But he knew, at that point, he knew that Abraham believed. And so if God has asked you, if he's made you a promise, but then he's also asked you to do something towards that promise, he wants to know that you've bought into the promise, that you believe him, that you trust him. Verse 16. The reason the promise is based on trusting is so that it may come as God's free gift. A promise that can be relied on by all the seed, not only those who live in the framework of Torah, but also those with the kind of trust Abraham had. Abraham, our father for all of us. This accords with Tanakh, with the scriptures, where it says, I have appointed you to be a father to many nations. Abraham is our father in God's sight, because he trusted God as the one who gives life to the dead and calls non-existent things into existence. Paul is contending that God based everything on trust. Not only so that we couldn't boast, but so that anybody with Abraham's kind of trust can come to him. We can be included in the family. That's what Paul's saying. It's open to everybody. That's why the circumcision is two chapters later. Anybody who trusts God gets put in the family. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. Hebrews 11. All he wants is our trust. Verse 18. For he, Abraham, was past hope. Yet in hope he trusted that he would indeed become a father to many nations, in keeping with what he had been told, so many will your seed be. His trust did not waver when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, or when he considered that Sarah's womb was dead too. He did not, by lack of trust, decide against God's promises. On the contrary, by trust, he was given power as he gave glory to God, for he was fully convinced that what God had promised he could also accomplish. This is why it was credited to his account as righteousness.